Hi guys, in this video we're going to be talking about head injuries and concussion. Now I have talked about head injuries in a previous video and I'm going to save the link below for you and also just here for you so you can have a look at that head injury video where I'll go into a bit more detail about other types of head injuries. Because today I'm going to be talking about concussion and concussion in relation to sporting activities. And the reason I'm talking about this today is because lots of sporting governing bodies have released guidance over the last year or two. We've had football, rugby and boxing. And just recently, in the last few weeks, British Cycling, which is the governing body for cycling, have just issued new guidance about what to do if someone suffers concussion. So please don't forget to watch this video all the way through to the end so you don't miss out on any important information. And also, please, if possible, could you hit that subscribe button and also the notification bell so you can watch all our future videos. So sporting bodies then are now really insistent, and rightly so, that if someone has concussion or suspected concussion, that they are to rest completely and do nothing for up to 48 hours after the suspected concussion. And they have to follow a gradual return to play that follows various stages, which I'll talk about later. But basically, they can't start sport-specific training for at least 14 days after, and they can't return to competition, sporting competition, until at least 21 days after the suspected concussion. Now, what is concussion then? Well, concussion is an injury to our brain, which results in a disturbance to our brain function. Now, I'm going to talk about the signs and symptoms of a concussion a bit later on, because a sign is something you can see and a symptom is something they're going to tell you. So there's things that are visible and also things that are invisible for us. So I want to talk to you about a bit later on. But I want to talk about what actually causes it, because we know what it is, but what actually causes a concussion? Well, there is a common myth that in order for someone to have concussion, they must be knocked unconscious. That is not true. Another myth about concussion is that a person has to have a head injury, and that's also not true. So concussion can be caused by a direct blow to the head or a blow to another part of the body which causes a transmitted force to the brain, the head, and a force delivered to the body which causes such kind of a whiplash type injury to the head and neck. So you don't actually need to have suffered a head injury in order to be able to have concussion or suspected concussion. And a concussion cannot be seen on an X-ray, a CT scan or an MRI of the head. Now, symptoms of concussion can typically occur immediately, but they could also be delayed, and sometimes it can be delayed up to 72 hours after the initial injury. Hence why it's really important to undertake repeated assessments of that person with suspected concussion. Now, loss of consciousness does not always occur, and that's a common myth, isn't it? In fact, it only occurs in less than 10% of people with concussion. So that's 90% of people do not go unconscious when they have concussion. Now, the symptoms of concussion generally resolve themselves over days after the initial injury, but in some cases it can be prolonged and it can take weeks and months for symptoms to start to resolve. In other words, to start to get better again. Okay, so let's talk about how to recognise a concussion. But I want you to always remember though, if you're ever in doubt, please always sit them out. So we're going to look for visible clues. So we're going to look for signs. Signs is something we can see. And a symptom is something that a person's going to tell you, and they tend to be invisible. So common signs of concussion would be someone that's dazed. They might have a very blank or vacant look. They could be lying motionless on the ground and very slow to get up. They could have problems with their balance, really unsteady on their feet, keep falling over, and have poor coordination. They might have lost consciousness or responsiveness. They could also be really confused and maybe not aware of the events leading up to the injury, or actually just their surroundings of where they are. They could just be grabbing and clutching their head. There could be cuts on their head. They could actually be having seizures. And they could be really emotional or irritable, something different about their behaviour. You might also speak to this person that's injured and find out how they're feeling, because these are going to be invisible symptoms. They might complain of a really bad headache. They might complain of dizziness or double vision. They might complain of their kind of brain fog feeling. They might have really severe neck pain or weakness or tingling in arms or legs. They might be really sensitive to light and noise. And if we suspect any of those signs and symptoms, we've got to get the person to stop what they're doing and sit out. Concussion can happen to anyone at any age. So how would you check somebody for concussion? Well, ask them questions, observe their behaviour. If it was a cyclist, you're going to look at the helmet for any damage on there. Have a look for any damage on that person. You know, a cracked or dented helmet could indicate they've got head injuries, and therefore you'd be suspecting concussion, and that person must stop what they're doing. You're going to ask them lots of questions to test their memory, to see what their behaviour is like, see what their balance is like. Are they complaining of any pain? You're going to look out as well for other signs of injuries such as spinal or shoulder or limb injuries. So you're going to check for concussion signs and symptoms. Remember, we're looking for both visible and invisible symptoms and signs. And concussion can affect people in 4 main areas. You know, physical, so that'd be them complaining of headaches or pain somewhere, they're very dizzy, problems with their vision. It could be someone that's got problems with their mental processing, so they're not thinking clearly, they don't quite know where they are, they can't remember what happened. The mood might be different, so they might be very short-tempered, emotional, or sad, and their sleep might be a problem. They're sleeping too much or not sleeping enough. So you're going to ask them questions. You're going to look at their signs, look at helmets as well, so there's any damage. You might also look at video footage of the event that led up to that injury, because that can actually show you how serious an injury is, because looking at video footage can actually show you or establish the mechanism of injury, and it can be used to assess the rider overall. But remember, if you suspect concussion, you must sit that person out. So when we suspect someone has got concussion, the very first thing we're going to do is make sure we stop what they're doing. Make sure they rest, and they're withdrawn completely from that sporting activity, and they're resting mentally as well. We're never going to leave them by themselves either. We're going to leave them with someone that is a responsible adult who is able to monitor their signs and symptoms and know how to get help if they deteriorated even more. We're going to make sure the person is not going to drive, and we're not going to allow them to drink any alcohol, or we're going to discourage that person from drinking alcohol for at least 24 hours afterwards. If the signs and symptoms start to deteriorate, so they have seizures, they've got spinal injury. If we suspect someone's got spinal injuries or broken limbs, we're going to keep them nice and warm and leave them where they are and call the emergency medical services. And if symptoms and signs deteriorated and we were concerned, we're going to as well speak to the emergency medical services. So when can they actually return back to sport? Well, rest is the initial cornerstone of managing concussion. And rest will include rest in the body and the mind. So physical and cognitive rest. And this period of relative rest allows the concussion symptoms to actually settle and allows a return to work or study. This period of relative rest would normally last until 24 to 48 hours after the initial concussion injury. And the person shouldn't even be thinking about returning to sport and cycling after concussion until the graduated return to play protocol has been followed. And what this basically means is a staged program that starts on midnight on the day of injury, and the earliest return to sport-specific training is 14 days after the initial injury. And in all cases, progression through all these stages of this protocol can only occur if the undertaken activity does not more than mildly exacerbate existing symptoms. So in other words, if taking part in activity doesn't make it get worse, doesn't make the symptoms get worse. So you're going to initially rest the mind and rest the body for 24 to 48 hours after the injury. Then after that, a person can then start thinking about going back to work or study, but you're not going to go back to sport to at least 14 days afterwards. And then competition should not occur to at least 21 days after the initial concussion or suspected concussion injury. So please make sure you follow the advice by your governing body. And if your governing body hasn't put any advice out there for concussion, please follow other governing bodies' advice. If we suspect concussion, or if the person has concussion, then we must make sure that person is resting. And that rest should ideally be 24 to 48 hours after the initial concussion. then that person should not be taking part in any training for at least 2 weeks, 14 days. And they shouldn't be taking part in any competition for at least 3 weeks, 21 days after that concussion injury. So please make sure we follow this guidance for everybody's sake, because our head has the most important part of our body, our brain. We do not want to have any permanent damage to that. Thanks for listening, guys. Stay safe and keep well.